You do know Chris loved her, Gus whispered. You know he would have done anything for Em. When Melanie swung around, she looked completely unfamiliar. What I know about Chris, she said, is that he's still alive. Calm the hell down. Nobody's gonna listen to you. You sound like a freaking chicken with your head cut off. Oh, I get it now. A name. A baby name. Okay. I'll get it now, because they're both pregnant. Ding, ding, ding. Okay. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of our book club series. I'm like super into this book. I don't know about y'all, but like it's 8 o'clock in the morning and I already want to film just so that I can read this book, if that says anything. I usually film at night. I don't know why, that's just like my peak time. But I woke up early today, so it's 8 a.m. and here we are with coffee. Of course, always with coffee and a tractor. I think I got this at a yard sale. I'm not lying. So, whatever time it's at, where you are, cheers to another day. And if you're having a shitty day, welcome to the club. I'm sorry. If you're having a bad day, I hope that this reading will at least calm your mind for a short period of time. I'm gonna go ahead and get started. We are on page, I'm trying to think, is there anything else I need to tell you guys about this? We got Mr. Sloth here today with us. Can y'all see him? See, if I move it down and then it cuts my head off. So he's there. He's there. Let's name this guy too. Well, y'all can't really see him, so I guess that don't matter. All right, I need to get started. All right, so let me find where we left off real quick. Hold on, please. I'm gonna sit back and get comfy, so I encourage you to do the same. Let me shut this door. Hold on. So we don't have the noise interference. We are starting on page 19. And we are on the third paragraph on page 19. And this again is called The Pact by Jodi Picoult. Even after their marriage and during their first few years of his small animal practice, Melanie had continued to work at the college. She advanced through the library system, figuring that if Michael woke up one day and decided not to love a stuttering wren of a girl, he might still be impressed by her mind. But Michael had gone to school to tend to cows and sheep, to breed horses, and after several years of neutering pedigreed puppies and giving rabies shots, he told Melanie he needed to make a change. The problem was there weren't very many farm animals in the big city, and that is where we ended last time. With Melanie's credentials, it had not been difficult for her to secure a position at the Bainbridge Public Library. However, Melanie was used to intense young men and women, to scholars bent into question marks over their texts, to kicking people out at closing time. At Bainbridge Library, the biggest draw was toddler story hour, because free coffee was served to their mothers. There were entire days when Melanie would sit at the reference desk and see only the mailman. She longed for a reader, a true reader like she was, and she found it in the unlikely form of Gus Hart. Gus came unfailingly to the library on Tuesdays and Fridays. She would waddle through the narrow arched doorway, dumping off whatever books she'd borrowed the day before. Melanie would carefully open them up and match up the drawn cards and set them on the dolly to be reshelved. Gus Hart read I'm sorry, I'm gonna sound really ignorant, so please don't prejudge me, okay? Gus Hart read Dostoevsky and Kundera and Pope. She read George Eliot and Thackeray and histories of the world, sometimes all in a matter of days. It amazed Melanie and it terrified her. As a librarian, she was accustomed to being the expert in her field, but she'd had to work at it. To Gus Hart, this sponging up of knowledge, like everything else, seemed to come too easily. I have to tell you, she said to Gus one Tuesday, I think you're the only person in this town who appreciates the classics. I am, Gus said soberly. I do. Did you like Le Morte d'Arthur? Gus shook her head. I didn't find what I was looking for. And what was that? Melanie wondered. Absolution? Entertainment? A good cry? As if Melanie had spoken aloud, Gus looked up shyly. A name. To find out that she was only skimming through looking for something. Oh my God. Okay, hold on. Just read it like you were reading it to yourself and like calm the hell down. Nobody's gonna listen to you. You sound like a freaking chicken with your head cut off. Was it challenge she felt from someone like Gus, who devoured intricate historical novels as if they were pulp fiction? To find out that she was only skimming through looking for something strong and classic to call her baby. Well, it should have depressed Melanie, but it didn't. What are you going to name yours? Gus asked. No one knew she was pregnant. She wasn't really showing yet, and she was superstitious enough to leave it a mystery for as long as possible. I don't know, she said slowly. Well then, Gus announced brightly. We're in the same boat. And pause. Moving on to the next section. Melanie, who had been too bookish in junior high school to have much of a social life, suddenly had a 7th grade friend. Somehow, instead of Gus's exuberance overshadowing Melanie's reserve, they complemented each other. It was not unlike the mixture of oil and vinegar, neither of which one wanted alone on one salad, but which together seemed such a natural twosome. It was easy to believe they'd been made with each other in mind. She would get calls from Gus first thing in the morning. What's it like out? Gus would ask, although the same weather was visible out of her own window. What should I wear? She would find herself sitting beside Gus on the big leather couch, looking at Gus's wedding album and laughing over the helmet-like hairstyles of her relatives. She would argue with Michael and telephone Gus just to be told unequivocally that she was right. Gus became comfortable enough to walk into the Gold household without knocking. Melanie borrowed baby name books on interlibrary loan and left them in Gus's mailbox. Melanie started to wear Gus's maternity clothes. Gus bought Melanie's favorite brand of decaffeinated coffee to keep on hand. They grew able to finish each other's sentences. So, Michael said, accepting the gin and tonic that James Hart had mixed for him. You're a surgeon. James settled across from Michael in a wing chair. From the kitchen, he could hear Gus and Melanie, their voices high and sweet as robins. That I am, James said. I'm finishing a fellowship over at Bainbridge Memorial. Ophthalmological surgery? He took a sip of his own drink. Gus tells me you took over Howard's practice. Michael nodded. He was one of my first professors at Tufts, he explained. When he wrote to say he was retiring up here, I started thinking there might be room for another vet. He laughed. I couldn't find a Holstein within 20 miles of Boston, but I saw 6 just today. The two men smiled uncomfortably and stared down at their glasses. Michael glanced toward the women's voices. They've hit it off, he said. Gus is over so much, I sometimes think she's moved in. James laughed. Gus needed someone like Melanie. I have a feeling she gets more support complaining about stretch marks and swollen ankles to your wife than she gets from me. Michael didn't say anything. Perhaps James was ambivalent about pregnancy, but Michael wanted as many details as he could get. Break. But Michael wanted as many details as he could get. He had taken books out of Melanie's library showing a blastosphere reconfiguring into a teeny human. He had been the one to sign up for natural childbirth classes, and as ashamed as Melanie was by her burgeoning body, sorry, I don't know that word either, burgeoning, he found it lovely. Pomegranate, ripe, and lush. It was all he could do to refrain from laying his hands on his wife whenever she breezed by him. But Melanie undressed in the dark and pulled the covers up to her chin, battled away his embrace. Michael had, from time to time, watched Gus move about his house, 5 months more pregnant and wealthy, but with a confidence and a vigor that lit her from within, and he would think, this is how Melanie should be. He looked toward the kitchen, caught a glimpse of Gus's swollen stomach preceding her. Actually, Michael said slowly, I kind of like this whole pregnancy thing. That's cute. That's so cute. You guys are into stuff like that. Take notes, boys. James snorted. Trust me, he said. I did an I don't know words today. Obstetrics rotation. Trust me, I did an obstetrics rotation. I know that's not the right way to say it. It's not, I'm sorry. I did an obstetrics rotation. Messy business. I know, Michael said. But pulling calves has to be different, James insisted. A cow doesn't scream out that she's going to kill her husband for doing this to her. A cow's placenta doesn't shoot across the delivery room like a silver bullet. Ah, Gus said, suddenly there. You're talking shop again. She put her hand on James's shoulder. My doctor husband is downright terrified of childbirth, she teased, speaking to Michael. Would you like to deliver my baby? Sure, Michael grinned, but I'm most comfortable operating in a barn. Gus took a cheese tray from Melanie's hand and set it down on the coffee table. I'm flexible, she said. Michael watched Gus settle on the arm of her husband's chair. James made no move to touch her. He leaned around her toward the cheese tray. Is this pâté? He asked. Gus nodded. Homemade, she explained. James goes duck hunting. Really? Michael said. He took a cracker and tried the spread. And deer hunting, and bear hunting, and once sweet little rabbit hunting, Gus continued. As you can see, James said, unruffled, Gus isn't a big fan of the sport. He looked up at Michael. I guess you wouldn't be either as a vet. But there's a real beauty to it. You are up before the rest of the world and it's absolutely quiet and you're putting yourself into the mind of the prey. I see, Michael said, although he didn't. This is kind of cool. I'm kind of enjoying getting a little backstory on their friendship. James is being an idiot, Gus said one snowy afternoon when Melanie called. He told me if I don't stop walking down Wood Hollow Road, I'm going to have the baby under a telephone pole. I would think you'd have more time than that. Try telling him. Use a different tactic, Melanie said. Tell him the better shape you are in before the baby is born, the easier it will be to get your old body back. Who said I want my old body back? Gus asked. Can't I pick someone else's? Farrah Fawcett? Christy Brinkley? She sighed. You don't know how lucky you are. Because I'm only 5 months pregnant? Because you're married to Michael. Melanie didn't answer for a moment. She liked James Hart, with his cool New England looks, his effortless charm, the thread of Boston accent in his speech. Many of the characteristics that Melanie possessed, James possessed also, but with a positive twist. She was reserved, he was level-headed. She was shy, he was introspective. She was obsessive, he was exacting. He was also right. Gus's water broke 3 days later, half a mile down Wood Hollow Road. And if a passing telephone company vehicle hadn't stopped to ask if she was all right, she might very well have delivered Christopher on the edge of the street. Moving on. The dream went like this. Melanie could see Michael's back as he crouched down in a stall, his silver hair glinting with the early sunlight, his hands moving over the heaving belly of a mare that was trying to foal. And she was standing overhead somewhere, in a hayloft maybe, water dripping down her legs as if she'd wet herself, yelling for him although no sound came out of her mouth. That was how she knew she was going to have her baby alone. I'll call every hour on the hour, Michael assured her, but Melanie knew how Michael functioned. Once he got wrapped up in a colicky horse or an ewe with mastitis, time fell away for him. Most of the roads he traveled as a country vet didn't have a luxurious string of telephone booths. Her due date came and went at the end of April. Then one night, Melanie heard Michael answer the phone beside the bed. He whispered something her mind did not register and disappeared in the dark. She dreamed again about the barn and woke up to find the mattress soaking wet. Pain made her double over. Michael must have left a note somewhere with the telephone number. Melanie walked through the bedroom and the bathroom, periodically stopping to sweat out contractions, but she couldn't find it. She picked up the phone and called Gus. Now, she said, and Gus understood. James was operating at the hospital, so Gus brought Chris along in his car seat. James was operating at the hospital, so Gus brought Chris along in his car seat. We'll find Michael, she assured Melanie. She placed Melanie's hand on the gear shift, telling her to squeeze when it started to hurt. At the emergency pavilion, she parked the car. "Stay here," she said, grabbing Chris and running through the sliding doors. "You have to help me," she shouted to the triage nurse. "There's a woman in labor." The nurse blinked at Chris. "Looks to me like you're too late," she said. "It's not me," Gus said. "It's my friend in the car." Within minutes, Melanie was in the delivery room, wearing a fresh Johnny and writhing in pain. How do you say this word? Obstetrics. The obstetrics nurse. That's what we're gonna go with. I could Google this, but I don't want to I'm not getting up right now. The obstetrics nurse turned to Gus. "I don't suppose you know where the father is?" "On his way," Gus said. Though this was not true, I'm supposed to stand in for him. The nurse looked at Melanie, who had reached out to hold Gus's hand, and at Chris, who was asleep in the plastic bassinet. "I'll take him to the nursery," she said. Can't have a baby in delivery. Can't have a baby in delivery. "I thought that was the point," Gus muttered, and Melanie choked out a laugh. "You didn't tell me this hurt," Melanie said. "Of course I did." "You didn't tell me," she amended. "It hurts this much." Melanie's doctor had also delivered Chris. "Let me guess," she said to Gus, reaching beneath the Johnny to check Melanie's cervix. "You had so much fun the first time you couldn't stay away." She helped Melanie sit up. "Okay, Melanie," the doctor said. "I want you to push." So, with her best friend bracing her shoulders and shouting in strident harmony, Melanie gave birth to a girl. "Oh my," she said, her eyes damp. "Oh, look at that." "I know," Gus said, her throat tight. "I see." And she left to find her own child. The nurse had just finished packing ice between Melanie's legs and drawing the covers up to her waist when Gus returned to the room with Chris in her arms. "Look who I ran into," she said, holding the door so that Michael could pass through. "I told you so," Melanie chided, but she was already turning the baby so that Michael could see her. Michael touched his daughter's fine blonde eyebrows. His fingernail was larger than her nose. "She's perfect. He shook his head and looked up. "I don't know what to say." "You owe me," Gus suggested. "I do," Michael said, smiling from inside. "I'll give you anything but my firstborn." The door of the room swung open again, and James Hart stood there in scrubs, holding aloft a bottle of champagne. "Hey," he said, pumping Michael's hand. "Hey," he said, pumping Michael's hand. What does that mean, pumping Michael's hand? Like a fist bump, maybe? Rumor has it that you've had quite a morning," he smiled at Gus. "And I hear you're a midwife." He popped open the moët, apologizing as some fizzed onto Melanie's blankets, and poured the champagne into 4 plastic cups. "To parenthood," he said, lifting his glass. Does she have a name?" Michael looked at his wife. "Emily," she said. "To Emily." Michael lifted his glass. "And belatedly, to Chris." Melanie glanced at the baby's translucent eyelids and slack bow mouth and reluctantly transferred her to the plastic bassinet in the bed. Emily barely took up a third of the space. "Do you mind?" Gus asked softly, pointing to the bassinet and then to Chris, snorting softly in her arms. "Go right ahead." Melanie watched Gus lay her son beside Emily. "Look at that," Michael said. "My daughter's an hour old and she's already sleeping with some guy." They all looked at the bassinet. The baby startled, a reflex. Her long fingers flailed open like a morning glory and curled back into fists, grabbing for purchase. Although she was completely unaware, when Emily Gold again settled into sleep, she was holding tight to Christopher Hart's hand. Dun dun dun. And break time. Mainly because I want to finish my coffee. And it's cold now. We'll be back. We're on page 24. BRB. So go take yourself a break. Go get yourself, if you don't have coffee already and you like coffee, go get yourself some coffee. Go get yourself some snacks. Whatever it is that you do, you go do that, okay? And then meet me back here in 4 minutes. Picking up on page 25. It says now, November 1997. There was very little that shocked Anne Marie Marone. She would have thought that her 10 years with the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police could offer more surprises than the subsequent 10 years in the sleepy town of Bainbridge, New Hampshire. But she'd been mistaken. In D.C., she'd never known her perks. Somehow, domestic abuse was more unnerving when it came at the hands of the legendary beloved Bainbridge Elementary School principal. A mafia-run drug ring was less disturbing than a field of pot, lovingly tended alongside the basil and marjoram and old Mrs. Inglenook's house. Finding a mortally wounded teenage girl and a bleeding boy and a smoking gun might not have been a routine occurrence in Bainbridge, but that didn't mean Anne Marie could not have seen it coming. "I'd like to speak to Chris now," she repeated. "You're wrong," Gus Hart said, folding her arms over her chest. "Maybe your son can tell me that." She would not offer the mother the truth, that although she didn't yet have grounds to arrest Christopher Hart as a suspect in a homicide, the case would be treated as one until proven otherwise. "I know my rights," Gus began. But Anne Marie held up her hand. "So do I, Miss Hart. And if you'd like, I'd be happy to read them to you and your son. But he's not under suspicion now. He'd just be helping us put together an investigation. And since he's the only living eyewitness to what happened, I can't see why you'd object to my conversation with him. Unless," she said, "he's told you something you feel a need to hide." Gus Hart's cheeks burned. She stepped back and let the detective enter the hospital room. Although the woman wasn't wearing a uniform or visibly carrying anything more threatening than a notepad, there was a self-righteous scent about her that swept into the room with her arrival, causing James to rise and sidle closer to Chris's bed. "James," Gus said quietly, hoping that her son would sleep through it all. "Detective Sergeant Marone would like to speak to Chris." "Well," James said, "as a doctor, I can tell you he's in no condition." "With all due respect, Dr. Hart," Detective Marone said, you aren't the attending physician. Dr. Coleman's already cleared my entry." She sat down on the edge of the bed and rested her notepad in her lap. Gus watched this woman sit where she was supposed to be sitting and sensed a rising swell in her chest that reminded her of the way she'd felt years ago when a toddler had pushed Chris at the playground, or when Chris's 5th grade teacher had intimated at a parent conference that he was less than perfect. Tigress, James had called her, when Gus went on the warpath to protect her child. But what, this time, was she protecting him from? Chris, the detective said softly. "Chris, can I talk to you?" Chris's eyes blinked open. Bedroom eyes, Gus had always called them. So fathomlessly pale against his dark skin and hair. "I'm Detective Marone from the Bainbridge Police." "Detective," James said, "Chris has been through quite a trauma. I don't see what it is that can't wait." Chris's hands tensed on the edge of the blanket. He looked up at the detective. "Do you know what happened to Emily?" It took a moment for Anne Marie to decide if the boy was asking her for information or offering his confession. "Emily," she said, "was taken to the hospital just like you." She flicked the ballpoint of her pen. "What were you doing at the carousel tonight, Chris?" "We went to fool around." He picked at the edge of his blanket. "We took some Canadian club with us." Gus's mouth dropped open. Chris, who had done volunteer work with her for MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, had been drinking and driving? "Was that all you had with you?" "No," Chris whispered. "I sort of took my father's gun." "His what?" Gus exclaimed, stepping forward at the same time James began to object. "Chris," Detective Marone said, not batting an eye, "I just want to know what happened tonight." She stared at him. "I need to know your story." "Because Em can't give you hers, can she?" Chris said, curling forward. "She's dead?" Before Gus could approach the bed and put her arms around her son, Detective Marone did it for her. "Yes," she said, as Chris broke into loud sobs. His back, the only part of him Gus could see in the policewoman's embrace, spasmed with coughs. "Did the two of you have a fight?" she asked quietly, releasing Chris. Gus recognized the exact moment that Chris realized what the detective was suggesting. "Get out," she wanted to say, that feral defense spilling out of her, but she discovered that she could not speak at all. She found herself, like James, waiting for her son to object, wondering for a flicker of a moment if he would. Chris shook his head forcefully, as if now that Marone had planted the seed in his thoughts, he needed to physically dislodge it. "Jesus Christ, no. I love her. I love him." "Excuse me." "Bless me." "Jesus Christ, no. I love her. I love him." He brought his knees up beneath the blanket and buried his face against them. "We were going to do it together," he mumbled. "Do what?" Although Gus had not been the one to ask the question, Chris glanced up at his mother. Fear stamped on his face. "Cells," he said softly. "Em was going to go first," he explained, still speaking to Gus. She shot herself, and before I got a chance to do it too, the police came." "Don't think about it," Gus ordered herself silently. "Just act." She ran to the bed and held Chris, her mind numbed by disbelief. Emily and Chris? Committing? It simply was not possible, but that only left another, more sinister alternative, the one that Detective Marone had posed. As unthinkable as it was that Emily herself, it was even more ludicrous to believe that Chris could have killed her. Gus raised her face above Chris's broad shoulder to see the detective. "Leave," she said, "now." Anne-Marie Marone nodded. "I'll be in touch," she said. "I'm sorry." Gus continued to rock Chris as the detective left, wondering whether she had been apologizing for what had taken place, or for what would happen when she returned. "Oh, loud. It's just getting good." My smartwatch is not happy with me. Please update. She wouldn't be the only one. My smartwatch is not happy with me. She wouldn't be the only one. So I put collagen in my coffee because, like, wrinkles, right? Like, I don't want wrinkles, obviously, and, like, I guess it's good for your bones or the stuff in between your bones. Something like that. And so the problem with it is it makes your hair grow, which is great, but I gotta shave my legs, like, so much more frequently because it, like, you don't think about things like that. You're like, oh, my hair's gonna be pretty and my bones, my collagen between my bones is gonna be, you know, good, whatever. You don't think, oh, hey, I'm gonna have to shave my legs like twice as much now because the hair grows ridiculously fast. But that's the thing. So if you start adding collagen into your daily regimen, just know your hair is gonna grow on every part of your body faster. Moving right along. Page 28. I'm seeing my ring light in this book right now. That is not good. Hold on. Michael put Melanie into bed, drifting on the Valium a sensitive ER physician had prescribed. He sat on the opposite side, waiting until he heard her breathing level off into sleep, unwilling to leave until he knew for certain that she too would not be taken from him unawares. Then he walked down the hall to Emily's room. The door was closed for privacy. When he opened it, a rush of memories tumbled out, as if the essence of his daughter had simply been bottled up inside. Dizzy with the gift of it, Michael leaned against the door jamb and breathed in the sweet, nutty fragrance of Emily's Body Shop perfume, the waxy, ethylene odor of the drying canvas where a recent oil painting stood. He reached for a towel slung over the footboard, still damp. She was coming back. She had to be coming back. There was too much left unfinished here. At the hospital, he had spoken to the detective assigned to the case. Michael had assumed a masked assailant, a mugging, a drive-by shooting. He had been fantasizing about wrapping his hands around the throat of the stranger who'd taken his daughter's life. He hadn't realized that person was Emily. But Detective Marone had spoken to Chris. She said that although any case like this one survivor, one dead, would be treated as a homicide, Chris Hart had talked a side pack. Michael had tried to remember details, conversations, events. The last discussion he'd had with Emily had been over breakfast. "Dad," she had said, "have you seen my backpack? I can't find it anywhere." Was that some kind of code? Michael walked over to the mirror hanging over Emily's dresser and saw in the reflection a face that looked too much like his daughter's had. He flattened his hands on the dresser, knocking over a small tub of Blistex. Inside, pressed into the translucent yellow paraffin, was the imprint of a finger. Was it her pinky? Was it one of the ones Michael had kissed when she'd been teeny and had fallen off her bike? Or gotten it caught in a drawer? He rushed out of the room, quietly left the house, and drove north. The Simpsons, whose prize thoroughbred had almost died giving birth to a pair of fillies last week, were surprised to see him in the barn at dawn when they went to feed the horses. They hadn't called him, they said, and everything really had been fine for the past few days. But Michael waved them away, assuring them that a free follow-up visit was always included for difficult labors. He stood in the stall with his back to Joe Simpson until the man shrugged and left. And then he stroked the slender flanks of the mare, touched the spiked, downy manes of her offspring, and tried to remind himself that he'd once had the power to heal. When Chris woke up, he felt like a lemon had wedged itself right in the middle of his throat. And his eyes were so dry the lids might as well have been closing over splintered glass. Stitches. He had a hell of a headache too, but he knew that was from the fall and the stitches. His mother was curled at the foot of the bed. His father had fallen asleep in the only chair. There was nobody else there. No nurses, no doctors, no detective. He tried to imagine Emily, where she was now. At some funeral home? In the morgue? Where was the morgue anyway? It was never listed on the elevator stops. He shifted uncomfortably, wincing at the thunder in his head, trying to remember the last thing Emily had said to him. His head hurt, but not nearly as much as his heart. "Chris," his mother's voice curled around him like smoke. She had sat up at the bottom of the bed. The blanket had etched a waffle print onto her cheek. "Honey, are you all right?" He felt his mother's hand on his cheek, cool as a river. "Does your head hurt?" she asked. His father, at some point, had awakened. Now both his parents were flanking the bed, a pair of matched bookends with pity and pain scribbled all over their faces. Chris turned onto his side and put the pillow over his face. "When you get home," his mother said, "you'll feel better." "I was going to rent a wood splitter this weekend," his father added. "If the doctors say you're up to it, there's no reason you can't lend a hand." "A wood splitter? A freaking wood splitter?" "Honey," his mother's hand fretted over his shoulders. "It's all right to cry," she said, repeating one of the zillion platitudes the ER psychiatrist had preached the night before. Chris showed no sign of removing the pillow. His mother grabbed the edge of it, tugging gently. The pillow tumbled off the hospital bed to reveal Chris's face, scarlet, dry-eyed, furious. "Go away," he said, spitting each word carefully. It was not until he heard the bell of the elevator at the end of the hall that he raised his shaking hands to his face, touching the span of his brows and the slope of his nose and the empty windows of his eyes, trying to discover who he had become. James crumpled his paper napkin into a ball and stuffed it into the bottom of his coffee cup. "Well," he said, glancing at his watch, "I ought to go." Gus looked up at him through the steam of her forgotten tea. "You what?" she asked. "Where?" "I have an RK at 9 this morning. It's already 8:30. Gus's throat worked, choking on disbelief. "You were going to operate today?" James nodded. "I can't very well cancel now." He started to stack cups and paper plates on the cafeteria tray. If I had thought of it last night, that would have been one thing, but I didn't. The way he said it, Gus thought, made it sound like it was all her fault. "For God's sake," she hissed. "Your son is suicidal, his girlfriend is dead, and the police still have possession of your gun, but you're going to pretend last night didn't happen? You can just go back to life as usual?" James stood up, took the first step away. "If I don't," he said, "how can we expect Chris to?" Melanie sat down in a room at the funeral home, waiting for one of the Saltzman sons to walk through the practicalities of grief. Beside her, Michael fidgeted with a tie, one of the 3 he owned and insisted on wearing here. Melanie herself had refused to change the clothes she had worn from last night. "Mr. Gold," a man said, turning into the room. Mrs. Gold." He clasped their hands in turn, holding them a moment longer than necessary. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Michael murmured thanks. Melanie blinked at him. How could she trust this man, so imprecise with his words, How could she trust this man, so imprecise with his words, to take care of the burial? To say there had been a loss was ludicrous. One lost a shoe or lost a set of keys. You did not suffer the death of a child and say there was a loss. There was a catastrophe, a devastation, a hell. Jacob Saltzman slipped behind his wide desk. "I assure you that we will do everything we can to make this transaction a little more peaceful for you." Transition, Melanie thought. Butterfly from cocoon, not... "Can you tell me where Emily is now?" Saltzman asked. "No," Michael said, then cleared his throat. Melanie was embarrassed for him. He sounded so nervous, so sure of making a mistake in front of this man. But what did he have to prove to Jacob Saltzman? She was at Bainbridge Memorial, but the circumstances of the death led to an autopsy. Then she's been taken down to Concord," Saltzman said smoothly, jotting down notes on a pad. "I assume that you'll want the burial as quickly as possible, which would put us at Monday." Melanie knew he was counting a day for the autopsy, a day to get the body back to Bainbridge. She made a small sound in the back of her throat before she could stop herself. "There are some items that we are going to have to discuss," Jacob Saltzman said. "First, of course, is the coffin." He stood up, gesturing to a connecting door in his office. "Would you step inside for a moment so that you can consider some of the options?" "The best," Michael said firmly. "The top of the line." Melanie looked at Jacob Saltzman, nodding easily. She thought of how this would be something to laugh at with Gus, the funeral business, a natural moneymaker. What grieving relative would haggle over the price of a coffin or ask for the bargain basement model? And is there already a plot? The funeral director asked. Michael shook his head. "Do you take care of that?" "We take care of everything," Saltzman said. "You just pay us. We do everything else." Melanie sat stone-faced through a discussion of announcements in the paper, of refrigeration, of acknowledgement cards, of headstones. Coming here was like being admitted to an inner sanctum that one silently questioned but did not really want the answers to. She had never realized, in fact, that there were so many details to death. If a casket would be open or closed, whether the funeral's home guest register would be leather-bound or paperback, how many roses to put in the breakaway spray. How many roses to put in the breakaway spray? Melanie watched the tally grow to a staggering amount: $2,000 for the casket, $2,000 for the cement case that would only postpone the inevitable, $300 for the rabbi, $500 to list the death in the Times, $1,500 to prepare the gravesite, $1,500 to use the chapel at the mortuary. Where would they get this money? And then it came to her, from Emily's college fund. Jacob Saltzman handed the total to Michael, who did not even blink. "That's fine," he said again. "I want the best." Melanie turned to Saltzman very slowly. "The roses," she said. "The mahogany casket. The cement around it. The New York Times." She began to shake. "The best," she said flatly, "is not going to make Emily any less dead." Michael blanched. He handed a grocery bag to the funeral director. "I think we ought to get going," he said quietly. "Here are the clothes." Melanie, half out of her chair, stopped. "The clothes?" "To be buried in," Jacob Saltzman said gently. "To be buried in," Jacob Saltzman said gently. Melanie grabbed for the paper sack and unrolled the top. She pulled out a rainbow print summer dress, far too thin for November, sandals that hadn't fit Em in 2 summers. She fished for a pair of panties that still smelled of fabric softener, and a barrette that had a broken clasp. Michael hadn't brought a bra or a slip. Were they even remembering the same daughter? "Why these things?" she whispered. "Where did you find them?" They were forgotten trends not have wanted. Clothes that she could not stand to be in for eternity. They had this one last chance to prove that they had known Emily, that they had listened. What if they got it all wrong? She ran out of the room, trying hard not to see the real problem. It was not that Michael was making all the wrong choices. It was that he was making choices at all. She ran out of the room, trying hard not to see the real problem. It was not that Michael was making all the wrong choices. It was that he was making choices at all. Anne-Marie Marone was waiting in the driveway when they got home. Michael had met the detective briefly last night, but he hadn't been in much of a mood to listen. She had delivered the unwelcome news about Emily and Chris trying else. Michael could not imagine what else she could possibly have to tell them, since Em was already gone. Dr. Gold, Detective Marone called, stepping out of her Taurus. She walked up the gravel path to their car. If she noticed that Melanie was still sitting in the front seat, staring at nothing, she didn't comment. "I didn't realize you were a doctor," she said amiably. She pointed to his truck, parked to the left, stenciled with the name of his practice. "Animals," he said tersely, "not the same." Then he sighed. However awful his own day was already going, Anne-Marie Marone was not the cause of it. She was only doing her job. "Look, Detective Marone, we've had a difficult morning. I don't really have time to talk." "I understand," Anne-Marie said quickly. "This will only take a minute." Michael nodded and gestured toward the house. "It's open," he said. He watched the detective open her mouth to give flack for the transgression, then think better of it. He walked to the passenger side of the car, unlatched the door, and pulled Melanie to her feet. "Come on inside," he said, gentling his voice to a sweet, slow croon, the same way he'd soothe a skittish horse. He led his wife up to the stone steps and into the kitchen, where she sat down on a chair and made no motion to remove her coat. Detective Marone stood with her back to the counter. "We spoke last night about the Hart boy's confession of a double," she said, cutting cleanly to the point. "Your daughter might have. You need to know that until proven otherwise. Her death is being treated as a homicide." "Homicide?" Michael breathed. With that one awful, seductive word, he felt a sinkhole of vindication open up in his mind, a chance to blame someone other than himself for Emily's death. "You're saying Chris killed her?" The detective shook her head. "I'm not saying anything," she said. "I'm explaining a point of law enforcement. It's standard procedure to closely consider the person found next to a smoking gun. The one who is still conveniently alive," she added. Michael shook his head. "If you come back in a few days, when things are more calm, I'd be happy to show you old photos, or Emily's school notebooks, or letters Chris wrote to her from camp. He didn't murder my daughter, Detective Marone. If he says he didn't, I believe him. I can vouch for Chris. I know him well." "As well as you knew your daughter, Dr. Gold? So well that you didn't realize she was..." Detective Marone crossed her arms. "Because if Christopher Hart's story is true, it means that your daughter wanted to kill herself, and that she did kill herself, without exhibiting any outward symptoms of depression." Detective Marone rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Look, I hope for your sake, for Emily's sake, and Chris's sake, that this is a double that got botched." Michael didn't need it spelled out. He realized that the probable cause would come from what Emily told them post-mortem, by means of an autopsy. "Do we get a copy of the medical examiner's report?" he asked. Anne-Marie nodded. "If you'd like, I can show you one." "Yes," Michael said, "please. It would be the last statement, the note she hadn't left." Anne-Marie nodded and started out the door. At the threshold, she turned. "Have you spoken to Chris yet?" Michael shook his head. It didn't seem like the right time." "Of course not," the detective said. "I was just wondering." She offered her condolences once again and headed outside. Michael walked to the basement door and opened it, releasing the two setters in a scramble of paws and frenzied movement. He shepherded the dogs to the driveway and stood in the open doorway for a moment. He did not notice Melanie, who pulled her coat closer in the sudden draft, her mouth rounded with the word homicide, her teeth sinking into it, unforgiving. Okay, I'm going to read this last. James was with Chris at the hospital, waiting for the attending physician to sign him out from the patient ward into the locked adolescent psychiatric unit. Gus had been relieved at the doctor's recommendation. She did not trust herself to see Chris in the signs of depression she'd apparently already missed. A trained hospital and experienced staff would keep him safe. James had had a fit. Would it show up on his permanent record? Would he have the ability as a 17-year-old to sign himself out at any time? Would his school, his future employers, the government ever have to know he'd spent 3 days in a psychiatric ward? Gus looked out the picture window in the living room to the neat path that ran between their house and the Goulds. This time of year, it was gilded with pine needles and damp with frost. She saw a light on upstairs in Melanie's bedroom. Then she tiptoed up to check on Kate, who'd heard the news of Emily's death that afternoon. As she'd suspected, her daughter had fallen asleep crying. Gus flung her coat over her shoulders and ran down the path, letting herself into the Gould's kitchen. There was no sound except for the loud ticking of the cuckoo clock. "Melanie," she called, "it's me." She started upstairs, poking her head into the computer room. Emily's bedroom door was closed. Gus made the conscious decision not to check inside. Instead, she knocked on the other shut door, the bathroom, and she slowly swung it open. Melanie was sitting on the closed lid of the toilet. At Gus's entrance, she glanced up, but did not register surprise. Now that she was there, Gus had no idea what to say. It seemed stupid suddenly to be the one to offer comfort when she was so closely tied to the pain. "Hi," Gus said softly. "How are you holding up?" Melanie shrugged. "I don't know," she said. "The funeral's Monday. We went to the mortuary." "That must have been awful." "I didn't pay attention," Melanie said. "I can't stand Michael right now." Gus nodded. "Yeah, James fought the doctor who wanted Chris signed into a psychiatric ward because it's a blight of the family name." Melanie looked up at her. "Did you see this coming?" she asked. And Gus did not pretend to misunderstand. "No," Gus said, her voice breaking. "If I had, I would have told you. And I know you would have told me." She sank down on the edge of the bathtub. "What could have possibly been so awful?" she whispered. She was thinking the same things she knew that Melanie was. Chris and Emily had grown up with love, with wealth, and with each other. What more could they have needed? Melanie grabbed the edge of the toilet paper and fed it through her fingers like a seam. "Michael brought this horrible outfit to have him buried in," she said, "and I took it away. I wouldn't let him use it." Gus stood up, relieved by the thought of something to do. "We have to find her something then," she said. She took Melanie's hand, tugging her upright, and led her to Emily's room. She turned the doorknob as if she wasn't scared to death of the memories that would come at her. But it was still simply, wonderfully Emily's room, a teenager's shrine to Gap clothing and perfume oils and snapshots of Gus's own son. Melanie stood uncertainly in the center of the room, ready to bolt, while Gus ferreted through the closet. "How about that turquoise blouse she wore for the school picture?" Gus asked. Her eyes looked so beautiful in it. "It's sleeveless," Melanie said absently. "She'd freeze to death." As Gus's hands stilled among the hangers, Melanie covered her mouth. "No," she moaned, her eyes brimming with tears. "Oh, Mel." Gus gathered her friend into her arms. "I loved her too. We all did." Melanie pulled away and turned her back. You know, Gus said hesitantly, "maybe I could ask Chris. He would know better than either of us what she wore to make herself feel good." Melanie did not respond. What had the detective told the Goulds? And more importantly, what did they believe? You do know Chris loved her," Gus whispered. "You know he would have done anything for Em." When Melanie swung around, she looked completely unfamiliar. "What I know about Chris," she said, "is that he's still alive." Dude, this is about to get real. Shit's about to get real up in here. And that's where we're going to end it for today. This book is so good. Like, I just want to keep reading. But this video would be like 6 hours long and no one would watch it if I kept reading. So we're going to end it here. Oh, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. And I hope that you're enjoying this book. I hope that you're as into it as I am, because I really am into it. Like, that's literally the only reason I'm filming this early in the morning. But yeah, what is today? Today's Wednesday. It's 9:30 in the morning. I hope that you guys have a fantastic day, whatever day and time it is that you're watching this. I love you so much, and thanks for hanging out with me. I will see you next time.
How y'all feel out there? I'm light years, call me eons. When the snare kick in, the beat is neon. Lights, yeah, I'm feeling magnificent. Care less what I'm up against.